picture a charming 1930s English village fete, where a priceless ruby brooch vanishes in broad daylight, replaced by a worthless fake. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet knitting, unravels a web of deceit among suspects. A flustered organizer, a nervous antique vendor, a secretive doctor, and a cunning jeweller. As clues emerge, a gold clasp in a garden, a suspicious parcel to London, Miss Marple's keen mind exposes a daring theft. In just moments, discover how greed and secrets unravel in St. Mary Mead, where no mystery escapes her notice. Chapter 1. The Fete at St. Mary Mead. The sun hung high over St. Mary Mead casting a golden glow across the village green, where the annual fete unfolded with its usual blend of cheer and mild chaos. Bunting fluttered between ancient oaks, and the air carried the mingled scents of fresh-baked scones, lavender sachets, and newly cut grass. Stalls lined the green, offering everything from Mrs. Bantry's homemade marmalade to old Mr. Pye's slightly dog-eared detective novels. Children darted through the crowd, clutching sticky toffee apples, while their elders exchanged gossip over cups of tepid tea. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wicker chair just outside the tea tent, appeared as much a fixture of the scene as the church spire in the distance. Her black lace mittens moved rhythmically, knitting needles flashing as she worked on a pale blue shawl. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail old lady enjoying the festivities. But her bright bird-like eyes missed nothing. She noted the vicar's wife fussing over a crooked sign, the postmistress's sharp glance at a latecomer, and the way young Tommy Pierce hovered too long near the cake stall. People, Miss Marple often thought, were so very predictable, yet so endlessly revealing. The fete's main attraction this year was a charity auction, organized to fund repairs to the church roof, which had developed a distressing habit of leaking during Sunday sermons. At the heart of the auction was a ruby brooch, donated by Mrs. Clara Winthrop, a widow whose late husband's passion for rare jewels had left her with a collection she neither understood nor much cared for. The brooch, displayed on a velvet cushion atop a linen-draped table, was a thing of understated beauty. A delicate web of gold filigree cradling a single ruby that caught the sunlight like a drop of fire. Mr. Alfred Harrow, the auction's organizer, stood guard beside it, his chest puffed out with self-important pride. A retired bank clerk with a penchant for order, he wore a tweed suit far too heavy for the July heat and mopped his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the crowd gathering for the auction. Mr. Harrow, she knew, was a man who thrived on routine, unlikely to let the brooch out of his sight, yet even the most diligent could be distracted. Nearby, Mrs. Lydia Trent, a sharp-eyed vendor of antiques, was rearranging her stall of chipped teacups and tarnished silver. Her quick movements and frequent glances toward the auction table suggested more than casual interest. Dr. Evelyn Carver, a newcomer staying at the vicarage, stood apart, her cool grey eyes scanning the scene, as she sketched in a small notebook. Miss Marple noted the doctor's composed air, so different from the village's usual bustle. Then there was Mr. Silas Gould, a jeweller from London, whose sleek black suit and polished manner stood out among the villagers' Sunday best. He had arrived that morning, ostensibly to bid, but his lingering near the brooch suggested a deeper curiosity. As noon approached, Mr. Harrow clapped his hands, calling the crowd to attention. His voice, reedy but authoritative, announced the start of the auction. Bidding began briskly, with villagers vying for jars of honey and hand-stitched quilts. When the ruby brooch was presented, a hush fell. Mrs. Winthrop, seated near the front in a lavender dress, smiled faintly as Mr. Harrow extolled the jewel's virtues, though Miss Marple suspected he knew little more than its estimated value. The bids climbed, £10, then £20, then £50, until Mr. Gould's crisp offer of £100 silenced the competition. A murmur of awe rippled through the crowd. Mr. Harrow, beaming, lifted the brooch to hand it to the winner. His fingers froze. The crowd gasped as one. Where the ruby brooch had been, a dull imitation now lay, its glass gem glinting cheaply in the sunlight. Mrs. Winthrop rose, her hand at her throat, and Mr. Harrow's face turned the colour of his handkerchief. "It's gone!" he stammered. "The real brooch! It's been stolen!" Chaos erupted. Voices overlapped, some indignant, others gleeful at the scandal. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing as she watched the key players. Mr. Harrow's hands shook as he clutched the fake brooch. Mrs. Trent stepped back, her face pale, but her eyes darting. Dr. Carver closed her notebook with a snap, her expression unreadable. Mr. Gould, however, leaned forward, offering to examine the imitation with a jeweller's loupe he produced from his pocket. "A clever fake," he pronounced, his voice smooth. "Quite worthless, I'm afraid." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already sifting through the scene. The fete's cheerful veneer had cracked, revealing the greed and guile she knew lurked in even the quaintest villages. Someone, she thought, had been very clever indeed, but not quite clever enough to escape her notice. Chapter 2. The alarm is raised. The sun, now dipping toward the horizon, cast long shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead, where the fete's festive air had dissolved into a hum of agitation. The ruby brooch's disappearance had sent ripples of excitement and dismay through the crowd, transforming the cheerful gathering into a tableau of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple remained in her wicker chair by the tea tent, her knitting needles moving with their usual steady rhythm, though her eyes, sharp as ever, darted from face to face. The villagers' reactions, she knew, were as telling as the theft itself. People, in moments of crisis, revealed their true natures, whether through a nervous twitch, a too quick denial, or a calculated silence. Mr. Alfred Harrow, the auction's organizer, stood at the centre of the storm, his face a study in mortification. His tweed suit, already wilting in the July heat, seemed to sag further as he clutched the imitation brooch, its glass gem catching the fading light with a dull, mocking gleam. "This is outrageous!" he sputtered, his voice cracking under the strain. "I was here the entire time, right beside it." "The brooch was genuine when I placed it on the table, I swear it." His monogrammed handkerchief, now crumpled, was pressed repeatedly to his brow, as if he could mop away the scandal. The crowd, gathered in a loose semicircle, murmured their doubts, their earlier admiration for his efficiency replaced by sidelong glances. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, the brooch's donor, had risen from her seat, her lavender dress trembling as she clasped her hands. Her face, usually serene, was flushed with distress, her grey eyes brimming with unshed tears. "It was my husband's," she said, her voice low but carrying over the hum. "A family heirloom, authenticated by experts. I saw it this morning. It was real." Her words, heavy with conviction, silenced the crowd for a moment. though Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in her posture. Mrs. Winthrop was not accustomed to being doubted, yet the theft had placed her in a vulnerable position, her generosity now a source of public scrutiny. Constable Slack, summoned from his tea at the Blue Boar, arrived with his usual brusque energy, his boots thudding on the grass as he pushed through the crowd. A man of action rather than subtlety, he carried a notebook and a pencil, which he brandished like weapons. "Right then," he barked, "nobody leaves until I've got to the bottom of this." "Who was near the table? Speak up." His tone, more suited to a parade ground than a village fete, did little to calm the onlookers, some of whom began to edge away, only to be halted by his glare. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, observed the scene with quiet intensity. Constable Slack's methods, she thought, were like a blunt instrument, effective for breaking things open but ill-suited for delicate work. She adjusted her shawl, her fingers never pausing in their knitting, and let her gaze settle on the key figures. Mr. Harrow, still blustering, was repeating his claim of vigilance, though Miss Marple recalled the moment during the auction when he had turned away to settle a dispute between two bidders over a chipped porcelain vase. A brief lapse, but enough for a deft hand to act. Mrs. Lydia Trent, the antique vendor, stood near her stall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her sharp features were set in a defensive scowl, though her eyes flicked nervously toward the auction table. Miss Marple had noticed her earlier, rearranging her wares with a touch too much haste when the brooch was first displayed. Now, Mrs. Trent's stall, cluttered with tarnished silver and faded lace, seemed to draw her like a shield. She muttered something to a neighbor about thieves everywhere these days, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple made a mental note of the small locked box she had glimpsed beneath Mrs. Trent's table, half hidden under a velvet cloth. It was an odd detail, one that nagged at her like a loose stitch. Dr. Evelyn Carver, the vicarage guest, stood apart from the throng, her grey eyes cool and unperturbed. She had closed her sketchbook and tucked it under her arm, her posture as composed as if she were observing a scientific experiment rather than a village scandal. When Constable Slack's gaze fell on her, she stepped forward, her voice calm and precise. "Perhaps a search of the grounds would be prudent," she suggested. "The brooch may have been dropped or hidden nearby." Her suggestion, reasonable on its face, drew nods from the crowd, but Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of her lips. Dr. Carver, she thought, was not a woman who acted without purpose. Mr. Silas Gould, the London jeweller, was the last to draw Miss Marple's attention. He had positioned himself near the auction table, his sleek black suit and polished shoes marking him as an outsider. When the fake brooch was discovered, he had been the first to offer assistance, producing a jeweller's loop with a flourish and examining the imitation with an air of authority. "A clever replica," he had declared, his voice smooth as polished glass. "The gold is base metal, and the stone is mere paste. Whoever made this knew their craft." His words had carried weight, but Miss Marple had caught the briefest hesitation in his movements as he handed the fake back to Mr. Harrow. It was the sort of hesitation, she thought, that betrayed a man who knew more than he let on. Constable Slack began his questioning with characteristic vigour, starting with Mr. "Harrow, you say you never left the table, Harrow." "But I heard you were fussing over some vase." Care to explain?" Mr. Harrow flushed, his handkerchief fluttering. It was a momentary distraction, a matter of seconds. 2 bidders were arguing, and I had to intervene. The brooch was still there when I returned. I'm certain of it. His certainty wavered under Slack's glare, and he added, "Well, I thought it was there." It looked the same. Slack's pencil scratched furiously in his notebook. He turned to Mrs. Winthrop next, his tone softening only slightly. "Mrs. Winthrop, you're sure the brooch was genuine when you gave it to Harrow?" She nodded, her voice steady despite her distress. "I examined it myself this morning. My husband's jeweller in London confirmed its authenticity years ago. The ruby was flawless, the clasp unique, a gold filigree with a tiny engraved rose. I'd know it anywhere." Her words, delivered with quiet dignity, silenced the murmurs around her, though Miss Marple noted Mr. Gould's faint frown at the mention of the clasp. Mrs. Trent was next, and her response was sharp. "I was at my stall all day, Constable, selling my wares. I didn't touch the brooch, nor did I want to. Antiques are my trade, not stolen goods." Her indignation rang a touch too loud, and Miss Marple observed the way her hands twisted in her apron. Slack, unimpressed, jotted something down and moved on to Doctor. Carver, who repeated her suggestion of a search with the same calm detachment. "I was sketching near the tent," she added, "but I didn't notice anything unusual." The crowd was quite dense. Her words were measured, offering nothing beyond what was asked. Mr. Gould, when questioned, adopted a helpful tone. "I was here to bid, Constable, nothing more. I saw the brooch when it was displayed. Quite a fine piece, though not unique. When the imitation appeared, I offered to examine it, as I have some expertise." He spread his hands, his smile disarming. "I'm as puzzled as anyone." Slack grunted, clearly frustrated by the lack of concrete answers, and announced a search of the grounds, ordering the crowd to stay put. As villagers began scouring the grass and peering under tables, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind turning over the details. The theft, she thought, was no impulsive act. The fake brooch required skill and planning, suggesting someone with access to both the original and the means to replicate it. Mr. Gould's expertise made him an obvious candidate, yet his readiness to examine the fake was bold. Too bold, perhaps, for a guilty man. Mrs. Trent's nervousness hinted at a secret, though whether it was the brooch or something else remained unclear. Dr. Carver's composure, meanwhile, struck Miss Marple as a mask, one she had seen on others who hid their motives behind a veneer of calm. And Mr. Harrow, poor man, was likely innocent, his distraction a convenient opportunity for the thief. The search yielded nothing, no ruby brooch, no clues hidden in the grass or tucked behind a stall. As the crowd dispersed, grumbling and gossiping, Constable Slack declared he would continue his inquiries the next day. "Someone here knows something," he said, his voice carrying a warning, "and I'll find out who." The villagers drifted away, leaving the green emptier than it had been all day, the bunting sagging in the evening breeze. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, her movements slow but deliberate. She paused by the auction table where the fake brooch still lay, abandoned in the chaos. She did not touch it, but her eyes lingered on its cheap sparkle. "A clever replica," Mr. Gould had called it. Miss Marple's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. Cleverness, she knew, often tripped over itself in the end. she thought of a young man in her village years ago, a forger who had been too proud of his work to resist showing it off. Pride, she reflected, was a dangerous thing. As she walked home to her cottage, the village settling into its evening quiet, Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. The brooch's theft was a puzzle, and she had always been fond of puzzles. The ruby, the clasp, the locked box, the sketchbook, each was a piece waiting to be fitted together. She thought of Mr. Gould's polished assurance, Mrs. Trent's nervous glances, Dr. Carver's cool detachment, and Mr. Harrow's flustered protests. One of them, or perhaps more, had orchestrated this little drama. And Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through the ordinary to the truth beneath, was determined to unravel it. Back at her cottage, she lit the lamp and settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as if it had never paused. The fete's excitement would keep Saint. Mary Mead talking for weeks. But Miss Marple had no need for gossip. The truth, she knew, lay in the small things, the glance that lingered too long, the detail that didn't quite fit. As the clock ticked softly on the mantel, she began to sort through the day's observations, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. The ruby brooch, she thought, would not stay missing for long. Chapter 3. A Visit to Mrs. Winthrop. The morning after the fete dawned soft and hazy, with a mist lingering over Saint. Mary Mead's meadows, as if the village itself were reluctant to face the scandal of the stolen brooch. Miss Jane Marple, up with the lark as was her habit, sat at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a single slice of toast, her thoughts already weaving through the events of the previous day. Her cottage, with its neat chintz curtains and polished oak furniture, was a haven of order, a stark contrast to the disarray the theft had brought to the village. She sipped her tea, her eyes resting on the garden beyond the window, where roses nodded in the breeze. The brooch, she mused, was more than a jewel. It was a key to human nature, and she intended to unlock its secrets. Miss Marple decided her first step would be a visit to Mrs. Clara Winthrop, the brooch's original owner, whose distress at the fete had been genuine but tempered by a certain dignity. She donned her black straw hat, pinned with a modest brooch of her own, and set out along the lane toward Winthrop Hall, a Georgian manor that stood at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls exuding faded grandeur. The walk was pleasant, the air fresh with the scent of damp grass, and Miss Marple's brisk pace belied her years. She passed the vicarage where Dr. Carver was reportedly staying, and noted the closed shutters suggesting the doctor was either out or disinclined to visitors. A small detail, but Miss Marple filed it away. At Winthrop Hall, a maid ushered Miss Marple into a drawing-room heavy with the weight of old money. Mahogany furniture, portraits of stern ancestors, and a faint smell of lavender polish. Mrs. Winthrop, dressed in a dove-grey morning gown, rose to greet her, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," she said, her voice warm but strained. "I'm afraid I'm still quite shaken by yesterday's events." She gestured to a chair and the two women sat, the maid bringing a silver tray with tea and delicate porcelain cups. Miss Marple, with her knack for putting others at ease, began with gentle inquiries about the fete, steering the conversation toward the brooch with the tact of a seasoned diplomat. "It must be distressing, Mrs. Winthrop, to lose such a cherished piece," she said, her tone sympathetic. "Could you tell me a little about it?" I understand it was your husband's." Mrs. Winthrop's eyes softened at the mention of her late husband, a collector whose passion for jewels had outstripped his business acumen. "Yes, it was one of Charles's favourites," she said, setting down her cup. "He bought it at an auction in Paris. Oh, nearly 20 years ago. The ruby is Burmese, quite rare, and the gold filigree is 18th century, with a clasp shaped like a tiny rose. I had it appraised last year in London, quite valuable, but I never cared for its monetary worth. I donated it to the fete because Charles would have wanted it to do some good." Her voice wavered, and she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding, though her mind was cataloguing every detail. The clasp, she thought, was a distinctive feature, one a thief might overlook in haste. "And you're certain it was the genuine article when you gave it to Mr. Harrow?" she asked, her tone mild. "Absolutely," Mrs. Winthrop replied, her chin lifting. "I examined it myself that morning, under a good light." The ruby had that deep, warm glow, nothing like the dull glass they found. And the clasp was intact, with its little rose engraving. I handed it to Mr. Harrow myself in its velvet case. Her certainty was unshakable, and Miss Marple believed her. Mrs. Winthrop, for all her wealth, was not a woman given to exaggeration. The conversation turned to the fete, and Miss Marple gently probed for more. "I understand Mr. Gould, the jeweller, visited you some weeks ago," she said, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "He must have been delighted to see such a fine piece." Mrs. Winthrop's brow furrowed slightly. "Yes, he came to the hall about a month ago, offering to appraise Charles's collection. He was very charming, very knowledgeable, knew all about Burmese rubies and antique settings. He spent some time examining the brooch, said it was exquisite. I told him I wasn't interested in selling, but he was quite persistent in a polite way. When he appeared at the fete, I assumed he'd come to bid." She paused, her fingers tightening on her handkerchief. "Do you think he could have—" Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile reassuring. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing of the sort," she said, though her mind was racing. Mr. Gould's prior visit was no coincidence, she thought. A jeweller with his expertise could have studied the brooch, perhaps even prepared a replica in advance. But she kept her thoughts to herself, steering the conversation to lighter matters before taking her leave. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the green, where the fete stalls were being dismantled under a greying sky. She paused by Mrs. Trent's antique stall, now half-packed, its clutter of teacups and candlesticks giving way to crates and burlap. Mrs. Trent herself was there, her movements quick and jerky as she wrapped a cracked vase in newspaper. Miss Marple approached, her smile as disarming as ever. "Good morning, Mrs. Trent. Such a pity about the fete, isn't it?" All that excitement over the brooch Mrs. Trent started, nearly dropping the vase. "Oh, Miss Marple. Yes, dreadful business. I've enough to do without thieves making trouble." Her tone was brisk, but her eyes darted to a small wooden box on the table, its brass lock glinting faintly. She moved to cover it with a cloth, the gesture swift, but not swift enough to escape Miss Marple's notice. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice light. "You must have been busy at your stall, with so many people about. Did you happen to see anything unusual near the auction table?" She asked the question as if it were mere curiosity, her eyes on her gloves as she adjusted them. Mrs. Trent shook her head, her lips tight. "I was run off my feet, Miss Marple. Customers all day haggling over every little thing. I didn't have time to watch the auction." She busied herself with the crate, her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, and wished her a good day. But as she turned away, her mind was alert. Mrs. Trent's nervousness was palpable, and that locked box, too small for her usual wares, suggested a secret she was eager to keep. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as she pondered the morning's findings. Mrs. Winthrop's account had confirmed the brooch's authenticity and pointed to Mr. Gould's prior interest a thread she intended to follow. Mrs. Trent's behaviour, meanwhile, hinted at something hidden, though whether it was the brooch or another matter was unclear. Miss Marple thought of a girl she had known years ago, a maid who had kept a locked box for love letters, only to be caught hiding stolen silver. People, she reflected, often hid one thing to conceal another. The mist had lifted, and sunlight filtered through her window, illuminating the roses outside. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to her thoughts. The brooch's theft was a carefully planned act, she was certain, and Mr. Gould's expertise made him a likely architect, yet Mrs. Trent's unease and doctor. Carver's shuttered vicarage suggested other pieces to the puzzle. She would need to observe them all closely, for as she well knew, the truth often lay in the smallest details. A clasp, a lock, a glance too quickly averted. Chapter 4. The Organizer's Tale. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaded windows of St. Mary Mead's Village Hall, casting dappled patterns on the worn oak floor where Mr. Alfred Harrow sat, surrounded by a chaos of auction ledgers and crumpled receipts. The hall, usually a place of whist drives and parish meetings, had become his temporary refuge, a bulwark against the whispers of scandal that followed the theft of the ruby brooch. Miss Jane Marple, stepping lightly over the threshold, found him hunched over a trestle table, his tweed suit rumpled and his face etched with worry. Her black straw hat tilted slightly as she greeted him, her voice as gentle as the breeze outside. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrow," she said, settling into a chair opposite him, her knitting bag placed neatly at her feet. "I do hope I'm not interrupting. I thought you might be feeling the strain after yesterday's events." Harrow looked up, his eyes bleary behind his spectacles. "Miss Marple, you're very kind to call," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "I'm at my wit's end, I confess. The brooch, gone, right under my nose. I've never felt such humiliation." He gestured to the papers before him, as if they might hold the answer to his disgrace. "I've been going over the accounts, checking every detail, but it's no use. The village thinks me careless." Or worse, Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet sympathy, though her mind was as alert as ever. She had known men like Harrow before, fussy, fastidious, and fiercely proud of their small domains. His distress, she thought, was genuine, but pride could cloud judgment as surely as deceit. "I'm sure no one doubts your diligence," she said soothingly, "but perhaps you could tell me about the auction, every little detail. Sometimes the smallest thing can shed light." Harrow sighed, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "I've gone over it 100 times, Miss Marple." The brooch was in its velvet case when Mrs. Winthrop handed it to me that morning. I placed it on the auction table myself, under a glass cover, and I never left it unattended. Well, almost never." He hesitated, his handkerchief appearing once more to dab at his brow. "There was a moment, during the bidding for a porcelain vase, when two gentlemen got into a heated dispute. I had to step away to calm them. It was only a minute, perhaps less." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew yarn from her bag, her eyes never leaving Harrow's face. "A minute can be enough for some," she said mildly. "And who was near the table during that time?" Harrow frowned, his memory straining. "Well, the crowd was thick, villagers mostly, bidding on trifles. I recall Mrs. Trent at her stall, not far off, but she was busy with customers. Dr. Carver was there too. She offered to help arrange the display earlier, though I told her I had it in hand. And Mr. Gould, of course, was hovering, asking questions about the brooch's provenance. He was very keen, said it was a rare piece. Harrow's voice took on a bitter edge. I suppose I should have watched him more closely, being an outsider." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, though she noted the mention of Doctor. Carver's offer to help. A helpful gesture could mask other intentions she knew, recalling a vicar's wife who had once helped with church funds to disastrous ends. "And when you returned to the table," she continued, "the brooch looked the same." "Exactly the same," Harrow said firmly, then faltered. "That is, I thought it was." The ruby gleamed, the gold shone. I didn't examine it closely until after the bidding, when I lifted it to hand to Mr. Gould. That's when I saw the glass stone, the cheap filigree. It was a shock, Miss Marple, a terrible shock." His hands shook slightly as he smoothed a receipt, betraying the depth of his agitation. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but probing. "And during the auction, did anyone else touch the brooch or the case? Perhaps someone helping with the display, or a bidder inspecting it?" Harrow shook his head. "No one touched it. The glass cover was my idea, to keep it safe. I lifted it only to show the brooch at the start, then replaced it. The cover was still in place when I returned from the dispute." He paused, his brow furrowing. "Though I suppose someone could have lifted it in that moment. But it was so brief, and the table was in plain sight." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. A glass cover, she thought, was no great obstacle to a determined hand, especially in a crowd's chaos. She recalled a pickpocket from her youth, a boy who could lift a watch in less time than it took to blink. "And Dr. Carver," she said, as if the thought were an afterthought. "You mentioned she offered to help. Did she linger near the table after you declined?" Harrow considered this, his fingers drumming on the table. "She did, now that you mention it. She was sketching, I think, always with that notebook of hers. She stood just to the side, near the tea tent, but I didn't think anything of it. She's a guest of the vicar, after all, a respectable woman." His tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Miss Marple. Respectability, Miss Marple thought, was a fine cloak for mischief. She smiled, her tone as gentle as ever. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Harrow. I'm sure the constable will sort it all out." She rose, gathering her knitting, and added, "Do try not to worry. These things have a way of coming clear." As she stepped out of the hall, the afternoon light bathed the village in a golden glow, though the air held the first hint of evening chill. Miss Marple paused, her eyes sweeping the green, where the last of the fate's debris was being cleared. Harrow's account, she thought, painted him as a man caught off guard, his pride wounded more than his conscience. His distraction during the auction was a critical moment, one a thief could have exploited with ease. Dr. Carver's presence near the table, ostensibly sketching, was a detail that nagged at her. And Mr. Gould's keen interest in the brooch, coupled with his expertise, kept him firmly in her thoughts. She walked slowly toward home, her mind sifting through the morning's conversations. Mrs. Winthrop had confirmed the brooch's authenticity and Mr. Gould's prior visit to her home. Mrs. Trent's nervous behaviour and that locked box suggested a secret, though its nature remained elusive. Now, Harrow's story added another layer, a brief window of opportunity, a glass cover that was no real barrier, and Dr. Carver's convenient proximity. Miss Marple thought of a governess she had once known, who used her quiet demeanour to mask a penchant for pilfering. Dr. Carver, with her cool reserve, might be cut from similar cloth. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. The village hall, with its clutter of receipts and Harrow's flustered confessions, had given her much to ponder. The brooch's theft, she was certain, was no spur-of-the-moment act. It required foresight, skill, and a moment of distraction. Harrow had provided the last, but who had seized it? As the clock ticked softly on the mantel, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Dr. Carver, whose sketching seemed less innocent with each passing hour. The puzzle, she knew, was taking shape, one stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The Enigmatic Guest. The vicarage of St. Mary Mead, with its rambling garden and weathered stone walls, stood as a quiet sentinel at the village's heart, its windows glowing softly in the late afternoon light. Miss Jane Marple, her black straw hat firmly in place, made her way along the gravel path to its door, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. She had decided to call on the Reverend Clement and his guest doctor, Evelyn Carver, whose cool demeanour at the fete had lingered in her mind like an unresolved chord. There was something about the doctor's composure, Miss Marple thought, that suggested more than mere indifference to the brooch's theft. People, she had long observed, rarely remained so unruffled in the face of scandal, unless they had something to conceal, or nothing to fear. The vicarage door was opened by Mrs. Clement, a cheerful woman whose boundless energy often outstripped her husband's more contemplative nature. "Miss Marple, what a delight!" she exclaimed, ushering her into the parlour, where a fire crackled despite the mild weather. "You've come to see Evelyn, I suppose? She's been such a help with the parish accounts, though I dare say she finds our little village dull after London." Mrs. Clement's chatter filled the room as she poured tea, her hands fluttering like birds. Miss Marple smiled, accepting a cup, her eyes drifting to the sketches pinned to a board near the window. Scenes of the village green, the church spire, and the fete rendered in precise, almost clinical lines. Dr. Carver entered moments later, her grey eyes as steady as ever, her dark dress severe against the parlour's cosy clutter. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and measured, "how kind of you to visit." She sat, folding her hands in her lap, her posture that of a woman accustomed to being observed, but revealing little. The Reverend, trailing in behind her, mumbled a greeting before retreating to his study, leaving the three women to their tea. Miss Marple, with her knack for disarming conversation, began with pleasantries about the fete, her tone as light as the lace on her collar. "Such a pity about the brooch," she said, stirring her tea. "It quite overshadowed the day's success." "I understand you were sketching near the auction table, Doctor. Carver, did you capture anything of interest?" Dr. Carver's lips curved in a faint smile, though her eyes remained guarded. "I was sketching the crowd mostly," she said, gesturing to the board. "Faces, gestures, the little details of village life. I'm afraid I didn't notice much about the brooch itself. I'm not one for jewellery." She reached for her sketchbook, which lay on a side table, and flipped it open to a page. Showing the fete's bustle, villagers milling about, Mr. Harrow at his table, the brooch a mere glint in the foreground. The drawing was meticulous, but Miss Marple noted the absence of certain figures. No Mrs. Trent, no Mr. Gould. "How charming," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but her mind alert. "You have a keen eye for detail. Were you near the table when Mr. Harrow stepped away?" "He mentioned a dispute over a vase that distracted him." Dr. Carver's fingers paused on the sketchbook's edge. The movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant eye. "I was nearby, yes," she said, her tone unchanged. "I offered to help with the display earlier, but Mr. Harrow was quite particular. I stayed to sketch, but the crowd was thick, and I was focused on my work." Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly before returning to her tea. A flicker of something, defiance perhaps, passing across her face. Mrs. Clement, eager to fill the silence, chimed in. "Evelyn's been sketching all over the village. Such a talent. She was out by the green yesterday morning, before the fete began, capturing the stalls being set up. And she's so quiet about it, you'd hardly know she was there." Her words meant as praise hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the implication. "Doctor." Carver had a habit of being present yet unobtrusive, a quality that could serve a thief as well as an artist. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of mild curiosity. "And did you see anyone near the brooch during the auction?" "Mr. Gould, perhaps, or Mrs. Trent. They were both close by, I believe." She asked the question as if it were an afterthought, her needles clicking softly as she drew yarn from her bag. Dr. Carver's gaze remained steady. "I saw Mr. Gould inspecting the brooch before the bidding started. He seemed very taken with it. Mrs. Trent was at her stall, I think, though I couldn't say for certain. My attention was on my sketch." Her answer was smooth, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to a young woman she had known years ago, a governess whose calm answers had hidden a penchant for taking what wasn't hers. The conversation drifted to parish matters, with Mrs. Clement prattling about the church roof fund, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Dr. Carver's sketchbook, she reflected, was a convenient prop, a reason to linger without drawing suspicion. Her offer to help with the auction display, though rebuffed, placed her near the brooch at a critical moment, and her claim of disinterest in jewellery felt at odds with her precise observation of the fete's details. Miss Marple recalled a doctor from her youth, a man whose detached manner had masked a calculating mind. People, she thought, often hid their true interests behind a facade of indifference. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by the sketchboard, her eyes lingering on Dr. Carver's drawings. "You've captured the village beautifully," she said, her tone admiring. "I do hope you'll share more of your work at the next fete." Dr. Carver inclined her head, her smile polite but distant, and Miss Marple took her leave, thanking Mrs. Clement for the tea. Outside, the vicarage garden was quiet, the roses heavy with the day's warmth. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind sifting through the encounter. Dr. Carver's composure was a puzzle in itself, too perfect, too controlled. Her sketchbook, while impressive, seemed a deliberate distraction, and her presence near the auction table raised questions. Had she been watching the brooch, or watching for an opportunity? Miss Marple thought of Mr. Gould's expertise and Mrs. Trent's locked box, but Dr. Carver's cool reserve was a new thread, one that tugged at her intuition. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The vicarage visit had added a piece to the puzzle, though its shape was not yet clear. Dr. Carver, she thought, was a woman who saw much and revealed little, a trait that could serve an innocent observer, or a careful conspirator. As the evening light faded, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving together the strands of suspicion that would, in time, unravel the truth. Chapter 6. The jeweller's past. The morning sun cast a soft glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, where she sat with a cup of tea and a letter from her nephew, Raymond West. The letter, penned in his usual brisk style, lay open on the table, its contents sparking a new thread in the intricate tapestry of the ruby brooch mystery. Raymond, ever eager to assist his aunt's quiet inquiries, had spent the previous day in London, digging into the background of Mr. Silas Gould, the jeweller whose polished manner and keen interest in the brooch had caught Miss Marple's attention. She adjusted her spectacles, her knitting needles resting momentarily, and read the letter again, her mind as sharp as the morning light. Raymond's findings were intriguing. Mr. Gould, it seemed, was well known in London's jewellery circles, a man of considerable skill, whose shop in Hatton Garden was respected, if not beloved. His reputation, however, was not without blemish. Some years ago, a scandal had surfaced involving forged gems, emeralds to be precise, sold to a prominent client. No charges were filed, as the evidence was circumstantial, but whispers of Gould's involvement lingered in the trade. "He's a clever one, Aunt Jane," Raymond wrote, "but not above suspicion. My contact says he's known for crafting replicas so fine they fool even experts, at least for a time." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A man who could craft such replicas, she thought, would find a ruby brooch an easy mark. The letter also mentioned a curious detail. Gould had recently been seen dining with a known dealer in untraceable gems, a man whose discretion was valued by those with items to sell quietly. "Nothing concrete," Raymond added, "but it's the sort of thing that makes one wonder." Miss Marple set the letter down, her eyes drifting to the garden where a blackbird hopped among the roses. She recalled a jeweller from her youth, a charming man whose deft hands had hidden stolen pearls in hollowed-out lockets. Cleverness, she knew, often came with a price. Determined to pursue this thread, Miss Marple telephoned Raymond to thank him and ask one more favour. Could he inquire about any parcels sent by Mr. Gould from St. Mary Mead's post office? The village postmistress, Miss Weatherby, was a font of local knowledge, and Miss Marple suspected she might have noticed something. Raymond, ever indulgent of his aunt's little hobbies, promised to make inquiries and ring back. With that, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, deciding to pay a visit to the post office herself, where Miss Weatherby's sharp eyes and sharper tongue might yield further clues. The post office, a cramped room smelling of ink and wax, was quiet save for the ticking of a clock and Miss Weatherby's rustling behind the counter. She greeted Miss Marple with a nod, her spectacles glinting as she sorted letters. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tinged with the satisfaction of one who knows the village's pulse. "Dreadful business about that brooch, isn't it? Folk are saying Mr. Harrow was careless, but I say it's deeper than that." Her tone invited confidences, and Miss Marple, with her usual tact, leaned into the conversation. "Indeed, it's quite a puzzle," she said, her voice mild. "I suppose you see all sorts coming through here, Miss Weatherby. Did Mr. Gould, the jeweller, happen to send anything after the fete? He struck me as a busy man, always coming and going." Miss Weatherby's eyes narrowed, sensing a chance to shine. "Funny you should mention him," she said, leaning forward. "He was in here the very next morning, sending a parcel to London." Heavy it was, more than you'd expect for a letter or a trinket. I asked if it was urgent, and he was all smiles, said it was just business papers. But papers don't weigh like that, Miss Marple. She tapped her nose, a gesture of shared conspiracy. He paid for express delivery too, which isn't cheap. Miss Marple's expression remained one of polite interest, though her mind seized on the detail. A heavy parcel, sent the day after the theft, suggested more than business papers. A ruby, even a fine one, was small, but a dismantled brooch, or other items to conceal it, might account for the weight. She thanked Miss Weatherby, purchased a few stamps, and stepped out into the village street, where the air carried the faint scent of baking bread from the shop nearby. As she walked, Miss Marple turned over the new information. Gould's past, with its hint of forgery, aligned neatly with the fake brooch's craftsmanship. His visit to Mrs. Winthrop weeks before the fete, his lingering near the auction table, and now this parcel, all pointed to a man with a plan. Yet his boldness in examining the fake brooch at the fete puzzled her. A guilty man, she thought, might avoid drawing attention to his handiwork. She recalled a forger in her village years ago, a man who had boasted of his skill to deflect suspicion, only to be caught by his own pride. Was Gould playing a similar game? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. The postmistress's account of the parcel was a significant thread, one that tied Gould to the theft more firmly than before. Yet she could not dismiss Doctor. Carver's cool presence near the auction table, or Mrs. Trent's nervous concealment of her locked box. Each suspect, she thought, played a role in this little drama, but the script was still unclear. Had Gould acted alone, or was there a partner, someone to distract Harrow, perhaps, or to hide the evidence? As she knitted, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the broader canvas of St. Mary Mead. The village, with its quiet lanes and gossiping corners, was a microcosm of human nature, where greed and cunning hid behind polite smiles. Gould's expertise made him the likely architect of the theft, but Doctor Carver's detachment and Mrs. Trent's unease suggested they, too, might have parts to play. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, a steady counterpoint to her racing mind. The truth, she knew, was like a pattern in her knitting, complex but discernible once you found the right thread to pull. Chapter 7. A Walk with Mrs. Trent. The lanes of St. Mary Mead were bathed in the soft light of late morning, the hedges alive with the hum of bees and the occasional flutter of a sparrow. Miss Jane Marple, her black straw hat tilted against the sun, walked with a purposeful step toward the village shop, where she knew she might find Mrs. Lydia Trent. The antique vendor's nervous demeanour at the fete, coupled with that intriguing locked box, had lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts like a snag in her knitting. A casual encounter, she decided, might unravel more than a formal visit, for people often revealed their secrets when caught off guard. The shop, a cramped emporium of necessities and small luxuries, was bustling with villagers stocking up on tea, sugar, and gossip. Mrs. Trent stood near the counter, examining a tin of biscuits with undue concentration. Her sharp features softened by the morning light, but still taut with unease. Miss Marple approached, her smile as warm as the sun outside. "Good morning, Mrs. Trent," she said, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of a neighbourly chat. "I was just thinking of you. Such a pity the fete ended in such a muddle. I do hope it hasn't upset your trade." Mrs. Trent started slightly, the tin slipping in her hands before she caught it. "Oh, Miss Marple! Yes, dreadful business, that brooch. It's all anyone talks about." Her tone was brisk, but her eyes darted to the shop's door, as if expecting an interruption. "My stall did well enough, but this theft, it puts people off, doesn't it?" "Makes them suspicious." She set the tin down, her fingers lingering on it as if anchoring herself. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of shared concern. "Indeed, it's unsettling for us all. I thought a walk might do us good. Clear the mind. Would you join me?" Her invitation was casual, almost an afterthought, but her eyes missed nothing as Mrs. Trent hesitated, then agreed with a tight smile. The two women stepped out into the lane, the village unfolding around them in a patchwork of cottages and gardens. Miss Marple steered their path toward the green, where the fete stalls had left faint scars on the grass. She kept the conversation light at first, remarking on the roses blooming in Mrs. Bantry's garden and the vicar's latest sermon. Mrs. Trent responded politely, but her answers were clipped, her hands twisting in the folds of her skirt. Miss Marple, with the patience of one who had unravelled many a knot, waited for the right moment to probe. "You must have been terribly busy at the fete," she said as they paused near the spot where the auction table had stood. "Your stall was so close to the action. I imagine you saw quite a bit, even if you were occupied with customers." Mrs. Trent's lips tightened, her gaze flickering to the ground. "I was run off my feet, Miss Marple." People haggling over teacups and spoons, hardly time to breathe, let alone watch the auction. She adjusted her shawl, a nervous gesture that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. "I saw Mr. Harrow fussing over his table, of course, and that jeweller, Mr. Gould, poking about. He was very interested in the brooch, asking questions before the bidding started. Miss Marple's needles, though tucked away in her bag, seemed to click in her mind as she registered the detail. "Mr. Gould, yes," she said, her tone mild. "He does seem a knowledgeable man." "And Dr. Carver, was she nearby?" "I heard she was sketching the crowd." Mrs. Trent nodded, her unease growing. "She was, now you mention it. Always with that notebook standing just by the tea tent. I thought it odd. She's so quiet you barely notice her, but she's always there, watching." Her voice held a hint of resentment, and Miss Marple wondered if it stemmed from more than just the doctor's reserve. They walked on, the conversation drifting to village matters, but Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the locked box she had glimpsed at Mrs. Trent's stall. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, yet its presence nagged at her like a missed stitch. "Your stall was so charming," she said, her voice warm. "All those lovely old things. I noticed a little box under your table. Such a pretty lock. Do you keep your best treasures in it?" Mrs. Trent's step faltered, her hand clutching her shawl. "Oh, that," she said, her laugh brittle. "Just odds and ends, Miss Marple. Bits of broken jewellery, nothing valuable." "I keep it locked to stop children." Poking about her words came too quickly, and her eyes avoided Miss Marple's, focusing instead on a distant blackbird perched on a gate. Miss Marple smiled, as if satisfied, but her mind was alert. Mrs. Trent's discomfort was palpable, and the box, she suspected, held more than broken trinkets. She recalled a shop girl from her youth who had hidden stolen goods in a similar box, claiming it held only sentimental keepsakes. People, she thought, often lied to protect something small, only to reveal something larger. As they neared the shop again, Miss Marple paused, her gaze soft but searching. "You've been most kind to humour an old woman's chatter," she said. "I do hope the brooch is found soon. It would be such a shame for the village to lose its trust." Mrs. Trent murmured agreement, her relief at parting evident as she hurried back into the shop. Miss Marple continued her walk home, the village quiet save for the distant clatter of a milk cart. Mrs. Trent's nervousness, she thought, was a thread worth pulling. The locked box might be a red herring, but its secrecy suggested a story, one that might intersect with the brooch's theft. Mr. Gould's interest, confirmed by Mrs. Trent, strengthened his place in the puzzle, while Dr. Carver's unobtrusive sketching took on a more sinister hue. Miss Marple thought of a seamstress she had known, whose quiet stitching had hidden a talent for eavesdropping on secrets. Dr. Carver, with her notebook, might be similarly adept at observing what others missed. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The walk had yielded more than fresh air. It had deepened her suspicion of Mrs. Trent's secret and sharpened her focus on Dr. Carver's role. Mr. Gould remained the most likely architect of the theft, but the puzzle was not yet complete. As the afternoon light slanted through her window, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving the strands of suspicion into a pattern that grew clearer with each passing hour. Chapter 8. The Constable's Progress. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its high-beamed ceiling and faint scent of polish, was abuzz with tension, as Constable Slack convened a meeting to address the theft of the ruby brooch. The late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the rows of chairs where villagers sat. Their whispers a low hum of anticipation and unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the back, her knitting bag at her side, appeared as unassuming as ever. Her black straw hat tilted slightly, and her needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm. Yet her eyes, sharp and bright, missed nothing, neither the nervous fidgeting of those summoned nor the undercurrent of suspicion that rippled through the room. Constable Slack stood at the front, his broad shoulders squared, and his notebook clutched like a talisman of authority. His face, reddened by the day's exertions, bore the frustrated scowl of a man who preferred action to deliberation. Right then, he began, his voice booming over the murmurs. "We're here to get to the bottom of this brooch business. It's been 3 days since the fete, and we've not a scrap of evidence to show for it. Someone in this village knows something, and I'll not rest until I've found it." His tone, more suited to a courtroom than a village hall, silenced the crowd, though Miss Marple noted the glances exchanged among the key figures: Mr. Harrow, Mrs. Trent, Dr. Carver, and Mr. Gould. Mr. Harrow, summoned first, stood with the air of a man facing a firing squad. His tweed suit, now creased from days of worry, seemed to hang loosely on his frame. "I've told you everything, Constable," he said, his voice trembling with indignation. "I guarded that brooch like my own life. It was under the glass cover, in plain sight, until that wretched moment I stepped away to settle a dispute. I was gone a minute, less even. When I returned, it looked the same until I lifted it and saw the fake." His hands fluttered to his handkerchief, which he twisted as if it might wring out his innocence. Slack's pencil scratched furiously. "A minute's long enough for a thief," he said, his eyes narrowing. "And you're sure no one touched the cover while you were distracted?" Harrow nodded vehemently, though his certainty wavered under Slack's glare. Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted his genuine distress, but also his failure to mention Doctor. Carver's offer to help with the display, a detail he had shared with her privately. Omission, she thought, could be as telling as confession. Mrs. Trent was called next, her sharp features set in a defensive mask as she rose. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair, and her voice carried a brittle edge. "I was at my stall all day, Constable, as I've said before. I didn't go near the auction table, and I didn't touch the brooch. I deal in antiques, not stolen goods." Her indignation drew murmurs from the crowd, but Miss Marple caught the quick glance she cast toward the door, as if longing to escape. Slack pressed her, asking if she'd seen anyone suspicious near the table. "I saw Mr. Gould sniffing about," she said, her tone sharp. "He was always hovering, asking about the brooch's value. And Dr. Carver was there, sketching, though she kept to herself." Her words, though pointed, lacked the conviction of truth, and Miss Marple wondered if her accusations were meant to deflect attention. Dr. Carver, summoned next, stood with the composure of a statue, her grey eyes cool and unyielding. Her dark dress lent her an air of severity, and her voice, when she spoke, was precise. "I was sketching the crowd, as I've explained," she said, holding up her notebook, as if it were evidence of her innocence. "I offered to assist Mr. Harrow with the display, but he declined, so I stayed near the tea tent, capturing the scene. I noticed nothing unusual about the brooch or the table." Her calm was almost unnerving, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers rested lightly on the sketchbook, betraying no hint of nerves. Slack, clearly frustrated by her brevity, asked if she'd seen Mr. Gould or Mrs. Trent near the table. "Mr. Gould was examining the brooch before the auction," she said, "and Mrs. Trent was at her stall, as she says. Beyond that, I was absorbed in my work." Her answer, like her demeanour, was impenetrable, and Miss Marple thought of a schoolmistress she had known, whose calm exterior had hidden a talent for manipulation. Mr. Gould, the last to be questioned, rose with a practised ease, his black suit immaculate despite the village's dust. His smile was disarming, his voice smooth as polished stone, I came to bid on the brooch, Constable, as I've said. It was a fine piece, and I examined it closely before the auction. Perfectly genuine, as Mrs. Winthrop claimed. When the fake was discovered, I offered my expertise, as any jeweller would. I'm as baffled as you are." He spread his hands, his loupe glinting in his pocket, a reminder of his authority. Slack, unimpressed, asked if he'd noticed anyone tampering with the table. "The crowd was thick," Gould replied, "but I was focused on the bidding." Dr. Carver was sketching nearby, and Mrs. Trent was at her stall. Mr. Harrow, of course, was distracted by that dispute. His answer, like Doctor Carver's, was careful, offering just enough to satisfy without revealing more. Slack, his patience fraying, announced that his men had searched the fete grounds again that morning, finding nothing. "We've checked every blade of grass, every stall," he said, his voice rising. "The brooch is gone, but it didn't vanish into thin air. Someone took it, and I'll find them." He dismissed the crowd, warning them to remain available for further questions. The villagers filed out, their whispers resuming, while Miss Marple lingered, her knitting needles still for a moment as she absorbed the scene. The meeting had been a study in contrasts. Harrow's flustered sincerity, Mrs. Trent's defensive bluster doctor, Carver's icy calm, and Gould's polished deflection. Miss Marple's mind turned over their words, sifting for the truth beneath. Harrow's distraction remained the critical moment, but the glass cover's presence suggested a swift, practiced hand. Mrs. Trent's accusations against Gould and Carver felt like a shield, protecting her own secret, perhaps that locked box. Dr. Carver's sketchbook, a constant prop, seemed less an artist's tool than a means to observe without being noticed. And Gould, with his expertise and questionable past, remained the most likely suspect, though his boldness in examining the fake brooch puzzled her. She recalled a thief from her youth, a man who had flaunted his innocence to mask his guilt, only to be undone by a careless detail. As she left the hall, the evening air cool against her face, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a call from Raymond West. He had spoken to a friend at the London post office, who confirmed that Mr. Gould's parcel, sent the day after the fete, had been delivered to a jeweller's shop known for discreet sales. "Not proof of anything, Aunt Jane," Raymond said, "but it's suggestive, don't you think?" Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. The parcel, heavy and express, strengthened her suspicion of Gould, but it also raised questions about his accomplices. Had someone else, Dr. Carver perhaps, played a role in the theft, or was Mrs. Trent's nervousness a sign of deeper involvement? At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. The village hall meeting had clarified little, but it had sharpened her focus. Gould's expertise and the parcel pointed to a calculated plan, but Dr. Carver's detachment and Mrs. Trent's secrecy suggested the puzzle had more pieces than she had yet uncovered. As the fire crackled in her hearth, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving the strands of suspicion into a pattern that grew ever more intricate. Chapter 9. A Discovery in the Garden. The garden of Miss Jane Marple's cottage was a haven of order, its rose beds meticulously tended and its paths swept clean of fallen leaves. On this particular morning, as a gentle breeze stirred the air of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple stood among her roses, secateurs in hand, snipping away faded blooms with the precision of a surgeon. The village was still abuzz with talk of the stolen ruby brooch, but here, in the quiet of her garden, she found clarity to sift through the tangled threads of the mystery. Her black straw hat shaded her eyes, which were as sharp as the blades she wielded, and her thoughts turned over the puzzle. Mr. Gould's suspicious parcel, Mrs. Trent's locked box, Doctor, Carver's cool detachment, and Mr. Harrow's flustered innocence. As she worked, the sound of children's voices drifted over the hedge, high and animated, from the lane that bordered the vicarage. Miss Marple paused, her secateurs still, as she recognized the piping tones of Tommy Pierce and his younger sister Lily, who were known for their knack of finding mischief. Their chatter, usually a backdrop to village life, caught her attention today, for the word shiny pricked her ears like a misplaced stitch. She moved closer to the hedge, her movements slow and unobtrusive, and listened. "We found it in the bushes, didn't we, Lily?" Tommy was saying, his voice full of self-important pride. "All shiny and gold, like a treasure. I said we should keep it, but you gave it to that lady." Lily's reply was indignant. "I didn't know it was important, Tommy." Dr. Carver was right there, sketching, and I thought it was hers. She said it was just an old earring anyway. The voices faded as the children scampered off, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind seizing on the word golden earring, Doctor. Carver had called it, but the description matched something far more significant. The unique gold clasp of the ruby brooch, with its tiny engraved rose, as described by Mrs. Winthrop. A child's innocent find could be the key to unlocking the theft, she thought, recalling a maid from her youth who had found a stolen ring in a garden and thought it mere trumpery. She set down her secateurs, brushed the soil from her hands, and resolved to visit the vicarage at once. The walk to the vicarage was short, the lane lined with hawthorn, and the air heavy with the scent of late summer blooms. Miss Marple's step was brisk, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, though her mind was far from the shawl inside. The clasp, if it was indeed the brooch's, suggested the jewel had been dismantled. A clever move to conceal its theft, but one that required a hiding place. Dr. Carver's role in receiving the shiny find raised questions. Why had she not reported it to Constable Slack? Miss Marple thought of a governess she had known, whose calm acceptance of a child's gift had masked her own pilfering. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement greeted her with her usual warmth, ushering her into the parlour where the fire was unlit, the room cool and shadowed. "Miss Marple, twice in a week," she exclaimed, her hands fluttering. "You'll have us thinking you're after the vicar's sermons." Her laughter was bright, but Miss Marple noted the absence of Doctor Carver, whose sketchbook lay closed on a side table, its pages unmarked by the day's light. "I was hoping to speak with Doctor Carver," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "I heard from young Lily Pierce that she found something in the vicarage garden, a small gold item, perhaps dropped during the fete. I thought it might be of interest given the recent theft." Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. "Oh, those children, always poking about." "Evelyn did mention something, a trinket Lily gave her, I think. She's out sketching now, but I'll fetch it." She bustled from the room, returning moments later with a small object wrapped in tissue. "Here it is." Evelyn said it was an old earring, but she kept it to be sure Miss Marple unwrapped the tissue. her fingers careful but steady. There, in her palm, was a gold clasp, delicate and intricately wrought, with a tiny rose engraved at its centre. It matched Mrs. Winthrop's description perfectly. The clasp of the ruby brooch, unmistakable in its craftsmanship. She turned it over, her expression one of polite curiosity, though her mind raced. "How curious," she said, her voice soft. "It's quite lovely for an earring." "May I show it to Mrs. Winthrop? She might recognize it, Mrs. Clement," oblivious to the clasp's significance, agreed readily, and Miss Marple tucked it into her bag, promising to return it. She declined tea, citing a need to tend her roses, and left the vicarage, her thoughts in a whirl. The clasp's discovery in the vicarage garden pointed to a deliberate act. Perhaps the brooch had been broken apart to smuggle the ruby, with the clasp discarded in haste. Dr. Carver's claim that it was an earring suggested either ignorance or deception, and Miss Marple leaned toward the latter. A woman of doctor. Carver's precision, she thought, would not mistake fine gold work for a common trinket. She detoured to Winthrop Hall, where Mrs. Winthrop confirmed the clasp's identity with a gasp. "That's it, Miss Marple, the rose clasp from my brooch." How did it end up in the vicarage garden? Her distress was genuine, and Miss Marple soothed her with assurances that the constable would be informed, and she left the clasp with Mrs. Winthrop for safekeeping, knowing it would soon be in Slack's hands, though she doubted he would grasp its full import. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. The clasp was a crucial piece of the puzzle, evidence that the brooch had been dismantled, likely to conceal the ruby's transport. Mr. Gould, with his parcel to a London jeweller, remained the prime suspect, but Dr. Carver's role was growing clearer. Had she found the clasp by chance and kept silent, or was she complicit in hiding it? Miss Marple recalled a nurse from her youth, whose calm exterior had concealed a talent for covering others' misdeeds. Dr. Carver, with her sketchbook and quiet presence, might be playing a similar part. The garden outside her window was quiet now, the children's voices gone, but the discovery they had sparked lingered in Miss Marple's mind. The clasp, the parcel, the locked box, the sketches. Each was a thread, and she was beginning to see the pattern they formed. As her needles clicked, she thought of the thief's boldness, dismantling a jewel in the heart of the village, boldness she knew often led to mistakes, and she was determined to find the one that would unravel the mystery. Chapter 10. The London Connection. The late summer light bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden hush, the village settling into the quiet rhythm of an ordinary afternoon. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage's small parlour, sipped her tea and gazed out at the garden, where the roses were beginning to droop under the weight of their own blooms. Her knitting lay idle for the moment, her hands folded as she considered the latest thread in the ruby brooch mystery, the gold clasp found by the Pierce children, identified as part of Mrs. Winthrop's stolen jewel. Its discovery in the vicarage garden had sharpened her suspicions of Dr. Evelyn Carver, but it was Mr. Silas Gould, the London jeweller, whose shadow loomed largest over the theft. The heavy parcel he had sent to London, as reported by the postmistress, was a tantalizing clue, and Miss Marple had asked her nephew, Raymond West, to dig deeper into its destination. Her thoughts, as always, were a delicate weave of observation and intuition, each strand carefully placed. The telephone rang, its shrill note breaking the cottage's calm. It was Raymond, his voice crackling with the excitement of a man who enjoyed playing detective for his aunt. "Aunt Jane, I've got something for you," he said, dispensing with pleasantries. "That parcel Gould sent from the village post office went to a shop in Hatton Garden, Carstairs and Sons, a place known for handling gems without too many questions. My contact at the post office says it arrived 2 days ago, and it was signed for by a Mr. Carstairs himself. No word on the contents, of course, but it's suggestive, don't you think? A jeweller like Gould sending a heavy parcel right after the theft. It's practically a confession." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Very suggestive, Raymond," she said, her tone mild, but her mind racing. "You've been most helpful. Could you find out if Mr. Carstairs has a reputation for dealing in, shall we say, items of uncertain origin?" Raymond promised to make further inquiries, his enthusiasm undimmed by the vagueness of her request, and rang off with a cheerful assurance that he'd have more soon. She returned to her tea, her thoughts turning over the new information. A parcel to a discreet jeweller in London, sent the day after the fete, pointed directly to Mr. Gould. The ruby, she suspected, had been removed from its setting, the clasp discarded to make the gem less recognizable. A man of Gould's skill could have crafted the fake brooch in advance, using his visit to Mrs. Winthrop's home to study the original. The heavy parcel suggested he had sent more than just the ruby, perhaps other items to mask its presence, or tools to disguise his work. She recalled a jeweller's apprentice from her youth, a boy who had hidden stolen gems in a shipment of costume jewellery, thinking it clever. Cleverness, she thought, often tripped over itself. Yet the clasp's discovery in the vicarage garden complicated the picture. Dr. Carver's claim that it was an earring was plausible, but unconvincing to Miss Marple's sharp mind. A woman of the doctor's precision would recognize fine gold work, especially if she had been near the auction table, as Mr. Harrow and Mrs. Trent had both noted. Was Dr. Carver an accomplice, tasked with disposing of the clasp, or had she merely stumbled upon it and chosen silence for her own reasons? Miss Marple thought of a nurse she had known, whose quiet efficiency had masked a willingness to look the other way for a price. Mrs. Trent, too, remained a puzzle. Her locked box, dismissed as holding odds and ends, was a detail that nagged at Miss Marple. Innocence, she knew, did not breed such nervous secrecy. She recalled a shopkeeper's wife who had hidden stolen silver in a locked tin, claiming it held only buttons. Mrs. Trent's unease suggested a similar deception, though whether it was the brooch or another secret was unclear. Miss Marple resolved to keep her in view, for even a minor player could shift the pattern of a mystery. She rose, donning her coat and hat, and decided to walk to the village green, where the fete's aftermath lingered in the form of trampled grass and forgotten bunting. The air was warm, the sky a pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud, and the village hummed with its usual rhythm. Children playing, a dog barking, the distant clink of teacups from the tea shop. As she passed Mrs. Trent's antique shop, now shuttered for the afternoon, Miss Marple noted a curtain twitch, as if someone had been watching the street. She made a mental note to inquire further about Mrs. Trent's activities, perhaps through the ever-observant Miss Weatherby at the post office. Her path took her near the vicarage, where she paused to observe the garden. The hedge where the Pierce children had found the clasp was unremarkable, its branches thick with summer growth. Miss Marple pictured the scene. A hurried moment during the fete, the brooch dismantled, the ruby pocketed, and the clasp tossed into the bushes, perhaps in haste, or as a deliberate misdirection. Dr. Carver, sketching nearby, could have seen more than she admitted or played a part in the act itself. Miss Marple thought of a lady's maid she had known, whose habit of lingering in gardens had masked her role as a go-between for thieves. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The London connection, with its discreet jeweller, was a strong thread, pointing to Mr. Gould as the mastermind of the theft. Yet Dr. Carver's role with the clasp and Mrs. Trent's secretive box suggested a broader conspiracy, or perhaps separate motives converging at the fete. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. The ruby, she was certain, was already in London, but the clasp's discovery meant the thief had left a trace. And traces, she knew, were the undoing of even the cleverest criminals. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her next step. She would need to confront the suspects soon, to test their reactions and see which threads held fast. The village, with its quiet lanes and hidden secrets, was a stage for human nature. And Miss Marple, with her unerring eye, was determined to see the drama through to its final act. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village's cottages and lending a deceptive calm to the air. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with a pot of tea and her knitting, felt the threads of the ruby brooch mystery drawing tighter. The gold clasp found in the vicarage garden, Mr. Gould's suspicious parcel to a discreet London jeweller, Mrs. Trent's secretive locked box, and Dr. Carver's calculated detachment had formed a pattern in her mind, one that required a careful tug to unravel. Juno. She resolved to test this pattern with a gathering of the suspects, a delicate manoeuvre to expose the truth through their reactions. Invitations were sent, and now, as the clock on her mantel ticked toward 4, she prepared to host a tea that would serve as more than a social occasion. The parlour was arranged with care. A silver tray with delicate cups, a plate of scones, and a vase of roses from her garden, their scent mingling with the tea's faint aroma. Miss Marple's black straw hat rested on a side table, her knitting bag at her feet, giving her the appearance of a harmless old lady. But her eyes were sharp, her mind as precise as the stitches in her work. Mr. Alfred Harrow arrived first, his tweed suit still creased from days of worry. "Miss Marple, I hope this isn't about that wretched brooch again," he said, his voice strained as he accepted a cup. "I've been over it a dozen times with Slack." "Just a friendly tea, Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But such a curious affair does bear discussion, don't you think?" Harrow nodded glumly, sinking into a chair. Mrs. Lydia Trent followed, her sharp features tense, her hands twisting in her lap as she sat. "I've nothing new to say," she declared, unprompted, her eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple noted the nervous gesture, reminiscent of their walk, and offered her a scone with a gentle smile. Dr. Evelyn Carver entered next, her dark dress austere, her grey eyes cool as she surveyed the room. "A charming invitation, Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth but distant. She took a seat near the window, her posture as composed as ever, though Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her jaw. Mr. Silas Gould was the last to arrive, his black suit impeccable, his smile polished. "Miss Marple, you do know how to make a man feel at home," he said, accepting tea with a flourish. His ease was almost too perfect, Miss Marple thought, like a performer on a stage. Constable Slack, invited for official presence, arrived in his uniform, his broad face set in a scowl. "I hope this is worth my time," he muttered, standing by the door as if ready to bolt. Miss Marple assured him it would be, her tone so mild it belied the trap she was setting. The conversation began lightly, with talk of the weather and the church roof fund. Miss Marple steered it gently toward the fete, her voice soft as she recounted the brooch's theft. "Such a bold act," she said, her eyes flickering over the guests, "to switch a genuine ruby brooch with a fake in front of a crowd. It required planning, skill, and nerve." She paused, sipping her tea, and produced the gold clasp from her bag, placing it on the table. The tiny rose engraving gleamed in the sunlight, and a collective stillness fell over the room. Dr. Carver's face paled, her cup clinking against its saucer. Gould's smile froze, his hand pausing mid-gesture. Mrs. Trent gasped softly, and Harrow's eyes widened. Slack, sensing the shift, stepped forward, his notebook at the ready. "This clasp," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, "was found in the vicarage garden by young Lily Pierce. Mrs. Winthrop identified it as part of her brooch. Quite a curious place for it to end up, don't you think?" She looked at Dr. Carver, whose composure wavered for a moment before returning. "It's merely an earring, Doctor," Carver said, her voice steady but strained. "Lily gave it to me, thinking it was mine. I saw no need to trouble the constable with a trinket." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, a challenge in their depths. Miss Marple nodded, as if considering this, then turned to Gould. "Mr. Gould, you examined the fake brooch at the fete. You called it a clever replica. I understand you're skilled in such work, replicas so fine they fool experts." Her words were gentle, but the accusation hung in the air. Gould's smile tightened. "I'm a jeweller, Miss Marple. It's my trade to know such things. I had no hand in the theft, if that's what you imply." His voice was smooth, but his fingers drummed lightly on his cup, a telltale sign of unease. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Trent. "And Mrs. Trent, your stall was so close to the auction table. That locked box of yours, could it have held something more than odds and ends?" Her tone was kind, but her eyes were sharp. Mrs. Trent's face reddened, her hands trembling. "I told you, it's just old jewellery, nothing to do with this." Her voice rose, drawing Slack's attention. She fumbled with her shawl, her agitation clear. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but relentless. "I believe, Mr. Gould, that you visited Mrs. Winthrop a month ago to study her brooch. You crafted a replica, did you not? During Mr. Harrow's brief distraction at the fete, you switched the brooch, later dismantling it and sending the ruby to a discreet jeweller in London, Carstairs and Sons, I believe." She paused, letting the words settle. The clasp, however, was a problem. It was discarded in the vicarage garden, where Dr. Carver found it. Dr. Carver's lips parted, but no sound came. Gould's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "You've no proof." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone unchanged. "But the parcel you sent the day after the fete was heavy, too heavy for a single ruby." And Dr. Carver, Your silence about the clasp suggests you knew its significance. Were you protecting someone, or were you involved? Dr. Carver's composure cracked, her voice sharp. I knew nothing of the theft. The clasp was a child's find. I thought it unimportant. But her hands clenched, betraying her. Mrs. Trent, trembling, broke the silence. I swear, Miss Marple, my box has nothing to do with this. It's just old family jewellery, things I didn't want mistaken for stolen goods. I was afraid, that's all. Her eyes filled with tears, and Miss Marple, with a gentle nod, believed her. The box, she thought, was a distraction, born of fear rather than guilt. Harrow, silent until now, spoke up, his voice shaking. I was distracted, yes, but I didn't take it. I swear it. His sincerity was palpable, and Miss Marple's glance softened. He was no thief, merely a pawn. Slack, his patience gone, stepped forward. Enough of this. Gould, what about that parcel? And you, Doctor? Carver, why keep the clasp quiet? His tone was gruff, but Miss Marple's calm held the room. Gould set down his cup, his face pale but defiant. You're weaving a tale, Miss Marple, but it's all conjecture. Yet his voice wavered, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Suddenly, Gould stood, his composure breaking. Very well, he said, his voice tight. I took the brooch. I made the replica weeks ago, after seeing it at Mrs. Winthrop's. It was a simple switch during Harrow's distraction. The ruby went to London, hidden in a shipment of tools. I thought the clasp was lost in the crowd. He glanced at Dr. Carver, his eyes narrowing. I had no accomplice. Dr. Carver's face remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened. Miss Marple, watching closely, spoke softly. Dr. Carver, you found the clasp and kept it, perhaps to protect someone, or to use it later. But silence is complicity. Dr. Carver shook her head, her voice cold. I made a mistake. That's all. But the room's tension spoke us otherwise. Slack, seizing the moment, took charge. Gould, you're coming with me. We'll contact London about that parcel. And Dr. Carver, don't leave the village. He turned to Miss Marple, his scowl softening. You've a knack for this, Mum. The tea ended in disarray, the suspects departing under Slack's watchful eye. Miss Marple remained, her knitting untouched, her mind satisfied yet alert. Gould's confession was a triumph, but Doctor. Carver's role was still a shadow in the pattern. As the sun set, Miss Marple knew the final thread was close to being pulled. Chapter 12. The Brooch Recovered. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, as if the village itself were exhaling after the tension of the past days. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, the fire casting a warm glow across the parlour, where her knitting lay finished on the table. A pale blue shawl, its stitches as orderly as her thoughts. The confrontation at her tea had unravelled the mystery of the ruby brooch, with Mr. Silas Gould's confession exposing his calculated theft. Yet, as Miss Marple's needles rested, her mind lingered on the loose ends. Doctor. Carver's enigmatic silence and the faint possibility of deeper complicity. The truth, she knew, was like a rose in her garden, beautiful when fully bloomed, but requiring careful pruning to reveal its shape. Constable Slack, invigorated by Gould's admission, had acted swiftly. With Miss Marple's revelation about the parcel to Carstairs and Sons, he contacted the London police, who descended on the Hatton Garden shop with the efficiency of a hawk. The ruby, still unset but unmistakable in its fiery glow, was recovered from a locked safe, nestled among lesser gems to avoid suspicion. The gold filigree setting, stripped of its clasp, was found in a separate compartment, awaiting a discreet buyer. Carstairs, under pressure, admitted to receiving the parcel but claimed ignorance of its stolen nature, a claim Slack dismissed with a grunt. The ruby and setting were returned to St. Mary Mead under police escort, arriving the following morning to Mrs. Clara Winthrop's tearful relief. Miss Marple, invited to Winthrop Hall to witness the reunion, watched as Mrs. Winthrop clasped the reassembled brooch, its rose-engraved clasp, restored by a local craftsman. "I never thought to see it again," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Miss Marple, you've done what no one else could." Miss Marple demurred, her smile gentle, insisting it was Constable Slack's diligence that deserved praise. But her eyes, bright and knowing, missed nothing as Mrs. Winthrop pinned the brooch to her dress, its ruby catching the morning light like a spark of triumph. The village predictably buzzed with the news. At the tea shop, Miss Weatherby recounted the tale with relish, embellishing Gould's downfall with details Miss Marple knew to be fanciful. Mr. Harrow, his reputation salvaged, resumed his duties at the village hall with renewed pomp, vowing to install a locked case for future auctions. Mrs. Trent, cleared of suspicion, opened her locked box to reveal a jumble of tarnished family heirlooms. Rings and lockets too sentimental to sell, but too worn to display. She donated them to the next fete, a gesture Miss Marple noted with approval, though she suspected it was born more of relief than generosity. Dr. Carver, however, remained a shadow in the resolution. She announced her departure from St. Mary Mead the day after the tea, citing a need to return to London for unspecified research. Her sketchbook, left behind at the vicarage, contained no new drawings, only the meticulous scenes of the fete that Miss Marple had seen. The vicar, puzzled by her sudden exit, remarked to Miss Marple that Dr. Carver had seemed unsettled after the confrontation, though she offered no explanation. Miss Marple, knitting quietly as he spoke, suspected the doctor's silence about the clasp was not mere oversight. A woman of her precision, she thought, might have kept it as leverage, perhaps suspecting Gould's guilt and hoping to gain some advantage. She recalled a librarian from her youth, whose quiet demeanour had masked a talent for blackmail. Dr. Carver, though not charged, had played a part too subtle for Slack's blunt methods to uncover. Miss Marple's nephew, Raymond West, telephoned that evening, eager for details of the resolution. "You've done it again, Aunt Jane," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "Gould's behind bars, the ruby's back, and the village is singing your praises. Though I wager you're already on to the next puzzle." Miss Marple chuckled, deflecting his praise with talk of her roses, but she admitted to herself a quiet satisfaction. The brooch's recovery was a neat stitch in the fabric of the mystery, but it was the human frailties, Gould's greed, Doctor, Carver's secrecy, Mrs. Trent's fear, that had woven the pattern she had unravelled. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village dark and still beyond her garden. Her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, starting a new project, a scarf perhaps for the vicar's winter sermons. The ruby brooch, now safe with Mrs. Winthrop, was a reminder of St. Mary Mead's deceptive tranquillity. Greed, she reflected, was a universal thread, as predictable in a village as in a city. Yet it was the small details, the clasp in the hedge, the heavy parcel, the nervous glance, that had betrayed the thief. She thought of a poacher she had known, caught by the glint of his knife in the moonlight. People she knew could not help but leave traces of their deeds. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple's needles clicked on, a steady counterpoint to her thoughts. The village would settle back into its routines, the fete a memory tinged with scandal. But Miss Marple, with her unerring eye for human nature, knew that saint. Mary Mead would never lack for mysteries. As long as there were people, there would be secrets. And she would be there, knitting quietly to unravel them.